Welcome, dear friends, to Daily Dharma Wisdom. Tonight, let us journey together into the stillness of noble silence and discover the gentle art of enough. Allow your body to soften, allow your breath to slow, and let these words be a companion as you breathe into rest.
Have you ever noticed how, just before you fall asleep, your mind often replays the day, sometimes with peace, sometimes with unease? What if, instead of carrying stress into the night, you could rest in a joy that needs no proof, no spotlight, no applause? Tonight, let's walk together into that kind of freedom. And as you settle into this practice, something changes. You begin to draw relationships into your life where joy can be shared openly, without fear of comparison, without the shadow of envy. The deeper your practice of mudra becomes, the less you cling to any single form of success. Why? Because you start to see what you were truly longing for all along, not the trophy, not the title, but the feeling, the warmth, the openness, that gentle sense of expansion. And here's the gift, you realize that this feeling doesn't only come from achievements. It is alive in connection. Joy becomes something you can touch in the resonance of another person's laughter, in witnessing someone's healing, in hearing a long silence finally break. It is there in beauty, not because you possess it, but simply because it exists. And suddenly, that is enough. Of course, moments of inadequacy still come. That's natural, but those moments no longer rule your life. You let them drift through, the way clouds pass across the sky. You remember, wholeness is never a competition. Wholeness is your birthright, and this kind of joy? It becomes your resting place. A quiet ground you can return to again and again, especially when the ego feels bruised, overlooked, or unseen. It whispers to you that your light has never depended on stage lights. That your life, lived in quiet sincerity, is already enough. From this ground, you give more freely, not out of emptiness, but out of fullness. You offer without demanding thanks, without expecting return. Your joy becomes your gift. And what a rare gift it is. A joy that doesn't need to take, doesn't need to perform, doesn't need to prove. It is a joy that heals just by being. A joy that gently reminds us, we're in this together. That is the way of mudra. Not easy, but real. Not loud, but deeply powerful. A joy that doesn't clamor to be noticed, yet quietly transforms everything it touches, steadily, completely. And then the heart begins to rejoice in the happiness of others. It unbinds itself from the endless hunger for validation. It finds rest more easily in presence. It softens toward others, but without losing its own center. Yet even with this opening, with these new ways of being, old patterns sometimes return. They come back in quiet hours, in the tension of old reactions, in the repetition of pain that seems to have no clear source. But these are not failures. They are echoes, signals that deeper layers are ready to be seen. These are patterns that logic cannot fix, effort cannot erase, positivity cannot override. They are the hidden loops of samsara, the unconscious cycles that have spun inside for years. And here, the next step is not escape. It is recognition, because samsara, in Buddhist teaching, is not only the vast cycle of birth and death. It is also intimate, psychological, personal. It unfolds in our own minds every day, in habits of fear, of craving, of aversion, of clinging, and a delusion. Samsara is the looping of thought that carries us back into suffering. And even when we know better, we get caught. It isn't your fault, it is conditioning. But conditioning can be seen. And once it is seen clearly, it begins to loosen. These inner loops may not be obvious. They often wear masks, disguised as personality. I'm just anxious. Or I'm always the one who gives more. But beneath those masks lie belief systems built long ago, often as a way to survive pain. The mind has its own ways of protecting itself. It builds strategies, ways to feel safe, to feel loved, to keep some sense of control. And even when those old strategies no longer serve us, they tend to repeat themselves. Why? Because they are familiar. They are like well-worn paths the mind knows by heart. One way to begin noticing these loops is not through endless analysis, but through gentle reflection, through presence. You simply watch. Where does my mind run when it feels threatened? Do you withdraw and disappear? Do you lash out in anger? Do you rush in, trying to fix everyone around you? These responses are not weaknesses. They are old maps, drawn long ago. At one time, they made sense. They helped you survive, so they do not need your shame. What they need now is compassion. You can also notice the residue they leave behind. Does a small situation drain you more than it should? Does your reaction feel larger than the moment itself? That is often samsara at work, the past pain replaying itself in the present. And here's the good news: recognizing this gives you agency. It breaks the trance of automatic reaction. Another way in is to look closely at your relationship with desire. In Buddhism, craving is not only about food, or pleasure, or possessions. Craving reaches deeper. It is the hunger for certainty, for control, for identity. The mind grasps and says, "I must have this. Only then will I be okay." And the wheel begins to spin. Yes, you may get what you wanted. There is a brief sigh of relief. But soon enough, the cycle starts again, not because you are living wrongly, but because you are caught in a pattern that cannot bring lasting peace. So how do you step out? Not by fighting the craving, but by meeting it with awareness. You pause and ask softly, "What am I really seeking right now?" More often than not, the answer is not the object itself. What we are longing for is something deeper, the feeling of being whole, of being seen, of being safe. When you recognize this longing beneath the surface, you can care for that place directly, instead of chasing satisfaction through things outside of you. And then, there is aversion, another wheel that keeps spinning. Aversion shows up as resistance, as judgment, as defensiveness. It insists, "This should not be happening," and then builds a case to prove itself right. But if you look closely, beneath aversion there is often fear, or grief. The reaction is only trying to shield something tender within. The practice here is not to suppress it, not to push it away, but to meet it, to recognize the feeling and name it. Aversion is here. Then breathe, then stay. That simple staying begins to soften the spin. It tells your nervous system, pain does not have to mean danger. Clinging to identity may be the most subtle samsara of all. The belief that you are a certain kind of person, that you must always act this way, or you won't be loved. These fixed self-views might have helped you once, but now they confine you. They narrow your experience. You might find yourself stuck in roles: the caretaker, the hero, the outsider, the perfectionist, not because these roles are your truth, but because they've become habits. The practice is to loosen this grip, not by rejecting yourself, but by bringing curiosity. You gently ask, what would it feel like to let this role rest? Who am I when I am not trying to be someone? And then, there is delusion, the final thread of samsara. It is not ignorance in a harsh sense. It is more like forgetfulness. Forgetting the impermanence of all things. Forgetting that pain will pass. Forgetting that thoughts are not facts. Delusion, this quiet forgetting, keeps the cycle alive by hiding the way out. The exit has always been there, but delusion places a veil over it. The way out, then, is to see clearly, not once, not twice, but again and again. You build this clarity not in grand moments of enlightenment, but in the simplicity of daily presence. You begin by noticing the body's signals. You slow yourself down in the space between stimulus and response. You soften. You bring kindness to your own inner world instead of rushing to fix or control it. And in that gentle space, something shifts. The old loops start to dissolve, not because you fought them, but because you understood them. Here, compassion is not optional, it is essential. Without compassion, awareness can easily turn into another weapon, another harsh voice inside telling you that you should have known better, that you shouldn't be repeating old pain. But compassion reframes everything. It whispers, this loop is not a failure. It's a call for care. Every repetition is a doorway, a chance to return to something that was never fully seen before. And when you step through that doorway with gentleness, the part of you that has been stuck in the loop begins to trust. It starts to release its grip. Sometimes, clarity arrives through pain. A relationship ends, and suddenly you can see the old pattern you've been repeating. A setback shakes you, and old narratives rise again. These moments can feel heavy, even unbearable, but they are also invitations. Invitations to see the samsara within yourself, and to respond differently this time, not perfectly, but with just a little more awareness. Ritual can help anchor this process. You might light a candle before you reflect. You might write a letter to the part of yourself that feels trapped. You might place a gentle hand over your heart when fear rises. These small acts are not solutions in themselves. They are signals to your nervous system, to your heart, that it is safe to see, safe to soften. And then, there is community. Samsara thrives in isolation, but when you bring your patterns into trusted spaces, when you speak them aloud, their grip begins to weaken. You realize you are not the only one. Others, too, are caught in their own loops. And in that shared recognition, something powerful happens. Shared reflection becomes shared liberation. The path out of inner samsara is not about arriving at some final destination. It is about shifting your relationship with the cycle itself. You stop believing it blindly. You begin to sense its rhythm. You recognize the early signs. And sometimes, that recognition alone is enough to slow the wheel, even to stop it. When the mind is free, it does not stop thinking. It simply stops clinging. When the heart is free, it does not stop feeling. It simply stops fearing its own tenderness. Liberation unfolds not as one great moment of awakening, but in countless small, steady openings. A single breath, a pause, a choice to listen instead of react, a willingness to see the moment as it is. And little by little, you notice, you are less controlled by old stories, less pulled by worn-out habits, more able to meet life as it arrives. You still feel deeply, but you no longer get lost in it. You still stumble, but you rise again more quickly. This is not perfection, this is maturity. You stop waiting until you are fully healed before you allow yourself to live. You live as you heal. You walk through the cycles with your eyes open. And each time you remember more quickly, I don't have to follow this pattern. I can meet what's real. I can choose presence over habit. And slowly, the loops lose their momentum. They quiet down, they dissolve, and what remains is not emptiness, but presence, not a void, but a clear space where you can meet life freshly, gently, wisely, without replaying what no longer serves you. This is liberation from samsara, not by escaping, but by truly seeing, not by fixing, but by freeing, not all at once, but breath by breath, layer by layer, until what once felt like fate begins to look like choice. Until what once controlled you becomes your teacher. Until you return, not to who you used to be, but to the truth that was always waiting beneath the spin. And as clarity grows, you begin to realize, not every feeling needs to be traced back to its root. Not every reaction needs to be solved. The grip of old narratives starts to loosen. And in that loosening, something new may arise, something unfamiliar at first. A quiet confusion, a spaciousness not yet filled. There comes a strange stillness, a quiet space where answers used to live. At first, it may feel unsettling, but this is not regression. And it's not avoidance. It is the beginning of something softer, something far more profound. It is the first step into the realm of not knowing. There is a kind of peace that does not depend on certainty, a clarity that does not come from explanations. Zen teachings have always pointed toward this path, not by building more theories, not by layering on frameworks of thought, but by inviting us into the radical act of resting directly in our experience, without the need to name it. To simply sit with what is. To let emotions be present without trying to divide them, fix them, or explain them away. This is the essence of beginner's mind. And beginner's mind is not naive, it is not pretending to know nothing. Rather, it is the gentle release of the need to know in order to feel safe. It is allowing the mystery of the present moment to unfold as it is, without rushing to interpret, to judge, or to resolve it. When you live this way, you invite an emotional honesty that bypasses performance. You are no longer trying to manage your feelings or perform stability. You are simply meeting them, face to face. In daily life, our habit is to label emotions almost instantly: sadness, anger, shame, and once we attach a label, the mind begins to build a story around it. That story often grows heavier than the emotion itself. But not knowing interrupts this momentum. It creates a gap, a sacred space between sensation and story. And in that space, true integration begins to happen. Not because the emotion disappears or is fixed, but because it is allowed to exist without being turned into an identity. This practice becomes especially important in moments of overwhelm. When emotion rises like a great wave, the mind instinctively scrambles to define it, to fix it, to justify it, and the more the mind tries, the tighter and more tangled everything feels. Zen offers a different approach, a non-move. Just stay, just feel the sensation in the body. Notice the breath as it comes and goes. Let thoughts drift by without grabbing onto them. The emotion may stay for a while, or it may shift, but your relationship to it changes. You're no longer swimming against the current. You are floating within it. This form of presence does not mean suppressing thought or emotion. It simply means relating to them from awareness instead of attachment. You notice the feeling. You sense its weight, its temperature, its rhythm, but you no longer demand an explanation. You no longer turn it into a problem to be solved. At first, this can feel deeply unfamiliar, even frightening, especially if your sense of safety has always depended on control. But over time, you discover the profound relief of not having to define everything. You realize there is wisdom in surrender. When you stop labeling your experiences as good or bad, progress or failure, something deeper is revealed. You begin to experience emotions in their raw form, not as threats, but as energy, as movement, as passing weather that does not need to be resisted. Zen calls this direct seeing. It is not about bypassing thought. It is about seeing before thought, feeling before concept, being before self-description. And in this space, emotions begin to integrate naturally, not because logic has solved them, but because awareness has allowed them. The body processes what the mind cannot. The breath becomes the bridge. This shift changes not only how you relate to yourself, but also how you meet others. When someone comes to you in pain, when someone speaks from confusion, the old reflex might be to jump in with advice, to offer solutions or insight. But with practice, you begin to see another way, one that begins not with answers, but with presence. Zen reminds us of something simple yet powerful. Presence is more healing than explanation. You don't always need the right words. You don't have to fix the problem. Sometimes, just being there is enough. Trust that your willingness to sit with someone in the unknown has its own kind of medicine. When you practice not knowing in relationships, you create space for real connection. You stop projecting your own assumptions onto the other person. You listen more deeply. Your words carry less urgency. You ask questions without demanding answers. And in that softer space, others feel permission to show up as they truly are. They sense they don't need to perform understanding in order to be accepted. They can be uncertain and still belong. This same approach also turns inward, toward yourself. When emotions arise without a clear reason, the mind often rushes to demand explanations. What's wrong with me? Why am I feeling like this again? But beginner's mind whispers, it's okay not to know. The feeling is here. That is enough. Stay with it. Trust that it belongs, even if it never explains itself. Over time, this trust begins to take root in the body. The nervous system slowly learns that safety does not require absolute clarity. It starts to soften in the midst of uncertainty. The mind, no longer interrupting, allows the heart to process in its own rhythm. And in this allowing, integration happens quietly, like the way the body heals itself as you sleep. One of the most practical gifts of this practice is its simplicity. You don't need a special place or elaborate ritual. You only need to pause, to feel, to let go of the urge to finish the thought, to breathe into the space that follows. Even just 5 seconds of resting in not knowing can begin to shift the inner landscape. And with that shift, your view of growth also changes. Growth is no longer measured by how many problems you've solved, or by how peaceful you feel each day. Instead, growth looks like this: your capacity to remain present with what is. To not panic when life gets complicated. To not harden when confusion arises. This is emotional maturity, not about having all the answers, but about cultivating openness. The path of not knowing also brings humility. You no longer need to be right to feel secure. You can admit, even to yourself, that you don't have all the answers. And strangely, that admission brings freedom. You stop resisting the mystery of life. Instead, you begin to live with it, to move with it, even to bow to it. But make no mistake, beginner's mind is not blindness. It does not mean abandoning discernment. It is clarity without clinging. You still make choices. You still use words when they are helpful. But you also know the difference between a label that helps and a label that confines. You begin to use words as tools, not as cages. This freedom extends even to your past. The constant need to fully understand your story begins to soften. You stop trying to pin down exactly why everything happened as it did. You let go of the search for the perfect narrative. Instead, you allow your story to remain fluid, alive, unfolding. You carry it more lightly, no longer letting it define you completely. And in this loosening, the self becomes more spacious, not because it has been perfected, but because it is no longer held so tightly. You find yourself less reactive, more responsive, less defined by emotion, yet more capable of meeting it without collapse. Beginner's mind is not passive. It is deeply engaged, but it engages with life in a relaxed way, curious, open, steady, not tense, not grasping. It meets the moment with a quiet reverence. Not because this moment is extraordinary, but simply because it is fully here. When you begin to live this way, joy returns, not in grand, dramatic ways, but in the subtlest of forms. In the rhythm of a single breath. In the stillness of an evening without noise. In the taste of tea, enjoyed without commentary. These are the kinds of moments we once overlooked, brushed aside as unimportant, yet now they begin to feel whole, complete, undivided. You no longer need to explain why you feel okay. You simply allow yourself to feel okay. And when you don't, you rest there too, without turning it into a problem, without demanding an immediate solution. In this way, not knowing becomes a teacher. But it is not the kind of teacher that lectures or hands out answers. It is the teacher that reveals quietly, that invites you deeper rather than instructing, that leads not with explanations, but with presence. It shows you how to let life speak for itself. You start to trust that every emotion, every silence, every moment of uncertainty belongs to something larger unfolding. You don't need to see the whole picture in order to belong to it. You just stay here, with less certainty, but more truth, with fewer conclusions, but more peace. And as you rest in that space, undefended, unclenched, awake, you discover that what once felt broken, incomplete, or in need of fixing is no longer a problem. It becomes part of the mystery you are learning, slowly, to love. When you release the urge to explain everything, when the mind stops rushing to define and categorize each feeling, something new opens inside. A spaciousness. In that space, emotions are free to rise and fall without resistance. Thoughts drift through without becoming arguments. And in the quiet that remains, something softer begins to speak, not in tidy ideas, but in fleeting glimpses, like light slipping through the cracks. You begin to sense that your story, the one you've carried for so many years, may not be as fixed as you believed, not because it was untrue, but because it was incomplete. It was written through a narrow lens. And now, with presence, you are ready to see more clearly, to look at your life not with judgment, but with understanding. This is the heart of right view. Right view is both the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path, and the thread that runs through every other step. It is not about adopting a new belief system. It is a way of seeing that brings balance, compassion, and clarity. It is choosing to view your life through wisdom rather than fear, through awareness rather than habit. And in this light, right view becomes a doorway to rewriting the internal story that has shaped your identity. Most of us inherit this story early in life, through repetition, through the feedback of others, through unspoken rules and painful experiences. Piece by piece, the narrative forms. This is who I am. This is what I'm worth. This is what I must hide. And often, that story goes unquestioned for decades. It becomes so familiar, so ingrained, that it feels like the truth itself. But right view gently asks, is this story skillful? Does it arise from clarity? Or from confusion? Does it lead toward freedom? Or toward more suffering? To begin healing through right view, you start by noticing these inner narratives, the quiet but powerful scripts that shape your choices. The ones that whisper, you are too much, or you are not enough. The ones that say, you are broken, difficult, unworthy. The practice is not to fight them, but simply to see them. To ask, where did these stories come from? Who first told me this? What conditions planted these seeds? Right view does not erase your past. It does not deny your story. What it offers is freedom, the freedom to see your past clearly, without becoming stuck inside it. As you begin to apply this new lens, something important becomes clear. There is a difference between pain and identity. Pain is real, it visits all of us. But when identity gets built around pain, it becomes heavy. It traps you, as if you are locked in place. With right view, you slowly realize, you are not your story. You are the awareness that holds the story. You are not the wound, you are the capacity to heal. This shift isn't just a nice idea, not merely a concept to think about. It unfolds gradually, through gentle repetition. When the inner critic shows up, and it will, you pause. You notice it. You ask yourself, does this thought reflect clarity? Or is it simply old conditioning speaking again? And in that pause, you give yourself room to choose. You stop blindly believing everything the mind says. You remember that the mind is shaped by habit, and habits can change. Right view also means seeing impermanence clearly. Everything is changing: feelings, thoughts, even the identities you've carried for years. Even your deepest beliefs about yourself are not permanent. They were formed through experience, and they can be softened, reshaped, through new experience. Doesn't that bring a kind of hope? Not a shallow hope that denies difficulty, but a hope that whispers of possibility. This perspective becomes especially powerful when you fall back into old patterns. Instead of saying, "I'm back where I started," you begin to see, this too is part of the process. It is not failure, it is unfolding. It is not a return, it is a reminder. The story does not end here. In fact, it deepens. Another aspect of right view is understanding karma, not as punishment, but as momentum. Every thought, every word, every action sets something in motion. The way you speak to yourself sends out ripples. The way you meet your pain today shapes how you will respond tomorrow. When you apply this to your sense of self, you see that identity is not a fixed status. It is constantly being influenced by how you relate to it. If you meet your inner world with kindness, new patterns take root. If you meet shame with presence instead of resistance, its grip weakens, and little by little, this is how the inner story is rewritten. It doesn't happen through big dramatic declarations. It happens through steady presence. You stop repeating old lines like "I'm a failure" or "I always mess things up." Instead, you begin to introduce new language. Language rooted in truth and clarity. Not fake affirmations, but honest acknowledgements. This is difficult. And I'm learning. I made a mistake. And I'm still worthy. I don't know yet. And that's okay. Over time, these phrases become more than words. They carve new grooves in the mind. They open new possibilities for how you experience yourself. And slowly, they begin to replace the old pathways, not by force, but by practice. Right view also transforms how you see other people. You begin to understand their behavior through the lens of cause and condition. They, too, are shaped by fear, by history, by confusion, by longing. This doesn't mean you excuse harm, but it does mean you stop taking everything so personally. You release yourself from resentment when you recognize shared humanity. You stop defining yourself by the way others treat you. Instead, you learn to trust your own view. This kind of clarity brings a grounded confidence. Not arrogance, but stability. You know who you are, not because of what others say, but because you are no longer confused by every passing thought. You're no longer clinging to a rigid image. You are open to growth. And as your view changes, so does your speech. You begin to talk to yourself with more kindness, and to others with more honesty, yet without harshness. You stop reinforcing harmful identities through constant repetition. Instead, you begin to speak words that reflect healing rather than harm. And your actions follow. You start to choose differently, from a place of wisdom rather than fear. The change does not happen because you force yourself. It happens because, with a clearer view, the old behaviors simply lose their grip. They no longer feel as compelling. You stop acting from self-punishment, from emptiness, from the need to prove. Instead, your actions begin to flow from alignment. Right view supports this shift by keeping you close to your intention. You ask yourself, why am I doing this? What result am I reinforcing? You don't need to be perfect. What you need is awareness. And that awareness gives you choice. Choice is freedom, even when painful memories rise to the surface. Right view helps you hold them differently. You don't fall headfirst into the full narrative. You see the memory as what it is, part of your past, but not your prison. You recognize that while you cannot change what happened, you can change what you believe about it. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What does this part of me need?" That clarity extends outward into your goals. Right view helps you see the difference between ambition driven by fear or ego and ambition guided by purpose. You stop measuring your worth by achievement. Instead, success becomes something else, alignment, not approval. In meditation, right view helps you meet your thoughts differently. You see them as passing phenomena. You don't fight them, but you don't chase them either. You sit, you observe, you begin to trust the stillness that can hold everything. This path is not linear. The rewriting of your story happens slowly, sometimes painfully, but it does happen. The more you return to the present, the more authority the old narrative loses. You realize you no longer have to be the person your wounds shaped you into. You can become the person your awareness reveals. This healing is not loud. It doesn't always show on the surface. But it is real. You see it in your choices, in your relationships, in the way you pause before reacting. You hear it in your own voice, softer now, yet clearer, more rooted in care. Eventually, you stop needing to tell yourself a better story. You simply live it. You trust that your life, as it unfolds through presence and right view, becomes the truest story of all. Not because it's flawless, but because it's no longer driven by illusion. And so, the journey continues, not with pressure, but with patience, not to arrive somewhere final, but to return again and again to what is real, to see clearly, to choose wisely, to live gently, and in this returning, to become free, as your inner lens clears, as your story no longer weighs you down with blame or illusion. Something deeper begins to call. It is not about achieving a perfect self. It is not about fixing what you thought was broken. It is about finding a place to rest. A place within that holds you even when life falls apart. A place untouched by mood or outcome. Even when thoughts quiet, even when identity softens, the human heart still longs for something steady, something it can trust. Something not made of conditions. This is where the teachings on refuge move beyond ideas and become lived medicine. This is the return to the triple gem, not as a belief, but as a sanctuary. Taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha is often presented as a formal step, a ceremonial gateway into Buddhist practice. But beyond the ritual, it points to something much deeper. It is an inner vow, a promise you make to yourself. I will no longer look only outward for safety. I will begin to seek steadiness where it can truly be found, within. To take refuge in the Buddha does not mean worshipping a figure from the past. It means recognizing, here and now, the capacity for awakening that already lives inside you. It is remembering that clarity, compassion, and deep wisdom are not distant goals reserved for some future life. They already flicker quietly in the small moments of presence you've experienced. When you take refuge in the Buddha, you are saying, I will trust the part of me that sees clearly. I will not follow the voices of fear and confusion. I will return again and again to what is real, even if I do not yet fully understand it. This is a profound psychological shift. Instead of seeing yourself as fundamentally flawed, you begin to honor your own potential for insight. The very same mind that once wandered endlessly is the mind that can find its way home. The very same heart that once closed itself off is the heart that can open again. Refuge in the Buddha means you stop abandoning yourself when you feel lost. You remember, your true nature is not brokenness, but awareness itself. Taking refuge in the Dharma is making a commitment to truth. Not rigid doctrines, not abstract theories, but truth as it reveals itself through careful observation. It is taking refuge in reality, the way things actually are. You begin to notice the patterns that create suffering, and the choices that lessen it. You learn to trust cause and effect. You align your life more with what brings clarity and freedom, and less with what fuels confusion. This is not about needing to be right. It is about being honest. When you take refuge in the Dharma, you stop pretending that ignoring pain will make it disappear. You stop chasing after happiness in ways that never last. You stop feeding the cycles that only leave you exhausted. Instead, you choose awareness. You pause before reacting. You listen for wisdom before speaking. You walk the path not because it is always comfortable, but because you've discovered it is trustworthy. And emotionally, this brings stability. You no longer depend on feeling good in order to feel safe. You learn to rest in the truth of impermanence, knowing deeply that even difficulty will pass. Your strength no longer comes from control, but from understanding. The Dharma becomes like a mirror, a quiet guide, a steady friend. Then there is the refuge of Sangha, the community of those who walk the path beside you. This might be a circle of practitioners, a teacher, a few close friends, or even an inner sense of companionship. It is the living reminder that you are not alone. Others, too, are meeting the same fears, the same doubts, the same questions. Awakening is never a solitary journey. It is shared, echoed, and strengthened in relationship. Taking refuge in the Sangha means allowing yourself to be seen. It means speaking honestly, listening deeply, and staying connected, even when it feels difficult. It means asking for help without shame. It means letting others support your clarity, while knowing they cannot, and do not need to, save you. This refuge touches directly the pain of isolation. When you practice alone for too long, it's easy to believe that your struggles are unique, that something is wrong with you. You may feel ashamed of your doubts or discouraged by your pace. But Sangha reminds you, there is nothing wrong with your process. Healing does not look the same for everyone. And even when your confidence falters, your presence still matters. On a deeper level, taking refuge in the Sangha is not only about the external community around you, it is also about the inner community within you. Think of the many parts of yourself: the inner critic who judges harshly, the wounded child who longs for care, the protector who tries to keep you safe, and the wise observer who sees with clarity. Refuge invites these parts to live in harmony. Slowly, the inner wall begins to soften. The parts of you that once fought with each other start to relate with compassion instead of conflict. Your whole inner system shifts, from feeling like a battlefield to feeling more like a team. And when the triple gem becomes a true personal refuge, it stops being abstract. It becomes alive, practical, intimate. When shame or confusion arises, you turn toward the Buddha nature within you. When you don't know what to do, you turn toward the Dharma, the wisdom of how things really are. When you feel disconnected and long for belonging, you turn toward the Sangha, the reminder that you are not alone. This kind of refuge is not about escaping the world. It is about learning how to be more fully in it, supported, guided, held. You carry this sanctuary with you. It shows itself in the way you breathe when you're anxious, in the choices you make when you're uncertain, in the way you return to awareness even in the middle of pain. Of course, there will be days you forget, days when you fall back into old patterns, when you numb yourself, when you react, when you pretend. But refuge means you don't stay there. It means you remember the path and return. Again and again, with patience, you begin to trust that there is something in you that cannot be lost. Even when everything else falls apart, a quiet stillness remains. You might practice touching this refuge with small rituals. Maybe it's bowing, lighting a candle, or softly repeating the phrases, "I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha." Not for show, not for performance, but as a way of grounding yourself. These words become like anchors when emotion rises or confusion spreads. They remind you, the path is alive, and you are walking it. This inner refuge also teaches you how to offer safety to others. When you truly embody the triple gem, people around you can feel it. They sense less judgment and more understanding. They feel your steadiness, not because you are flawless, but because you are rooted. You offer presence instead of advice, warmth instead of quick solutions, space instead of pressure. Over time, refuge becomes less about searching and more about resting. You don't need to scramble for it only in crisis, because it is already inside you. Your mind begins to trust stillness. Your heart begins to trust kindness. Your life begins to trust the path itself. And from that trust, everything slowly shifts, not in dramatic explosions, but in quiet, unshakable ways. You start living less from fear and more from alignment, less from striving and more from belonging. You stop desperately reaching for safety outside yourself, and instead begin to embody it from within. This is what it truly means to take refuge, not to run from the storm, but to carry shelter with you into every single moment. Not to abandon the world, but to meet it with the strength of someone who knows they are held, guided, and never truly alone. And once you begin to feel supported by something deeper than approval or performance, once the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are no longer just words but living supports you can lean into, something new becomes possible. You start to feel safe enough to come closer. Closer not only to yourself, but also to others. You begin to notice the subtle patterns in the way you connect, the places inside that still tighten when you feel misunderstood, the moments you retreat without knowing why. And even as your awareness deepens, even as your inner refuge grows stronger, the old wounds of relationship still arise. And in those tender places, where you feel misunderstood, where old wounds rise up, what's often most needed is not more clarity, not more solitude, but gentleness, a softer way of being with yourself and with others. The next step of practice is learning how to bring this inner work into your relationships. Not by rushing to fix them, but by showing up differently within them. This is where the Buddhist precepts take on new life. They are sometimes mistaken for commandments, strict moral codes, or external rules to obey. But on the Buddhist path, the precepts are not about rigid morality. They are more like relational guidelines, gentle invitations into integrity, practical tools for aligning your inner values with the way you connect to others. They are not enforced from the outside. They grow from within. Their purpose is not to control your behavior, but to help you stay in harmony with yourself, with others, and with the truth of each moment. When you hold the precepts as healing practices, they become a way of relating without reenacting your old wounds. They provide a structure that allows intimacy without collapse. They protect what matters most in relationships: trust, presence, and mutual care. The first precept, to refrain from harming living beings, goes beyond physical harm. It also includes emotional harm, subtle harm, and even the energetic harm that comes from harshness or neglect. It invites you to pause before reacting, to feel into the impact of your words and actions. You begin to recognize those moments when blame or defensiveness is about to take over. And in that pause, you ask yourself, is this response aligned with my deeper intention? Does it protect connection, or does it break it? This pause begins to rewire relationships that were once driven by reactivity. It creates space where compassion can enter, where once there was only reaction. The second precept, to refrain from taking what is not freely given, is not only about physical objects. It applies to attention, to time, to energy, and to emotional labor. It asks us to respect boundaries, both spoken and unspoken, clear and subtle. In healing relationships, This is profound. Many of our deepest hurts come from moments when our consent, our boundaries, or our presence were not respected, not just physically, but emotionally, when expectations, pressure, or unspoken demands crossed our limits. This precept helps you see where you might unconsciously be pulling for validation, asking for care in ways others cannot give, or offering yourself with hidden expectations of return. It invites clarity over coercion, invitation over assumption. The third precept, to engage in sexual conduct with care and mindfulness, reminds us that intimacy should be rooted in honesty, respect, and mutual well-being, and it extends far beyond physical intimacy. At its core, it speaks to the deep human longing to be seen, to be touched emotionally, to be known. When these desires are misunderstood or unmet, they can twist into manipulation, or create painful dynamics. But when they are met with clarity, tenderness, and honesty, they can become the foundation for deep connection. This precept invites those difficult, often unspoken conversations. It encourages moving slowly, with intention, so that desire is not distorted by fear or urgency. And then there is the fourth precept, to refrain from false speech. Perhaps this is the most powerful precept for healing relational wounds. It is not just about avoiding lies in the factual sense. It is about intention. Are your words meant to reveal or to protect? To connect or to control? This includes honesty with yourself as well. Because sometimes, false speech shows up not in the words we tell others, but in the truths we edit or hide within ourselves, just to maintain closeness, just to avoid conflict. This precept invites you to speak from your center, not from performance, not from trying to impress, but from presence. You begin to learn how to tell the truth with kindness, and just as importantly, how to receive the truth without collapsing or turning away. The fifth precept, to refrain from intoxicants that cloud the mind, includes more than just substances. It also points to the subtle intoxicants we often overlook: overthinking, constant distraction, emotional reactivity, or the endless craving for approval. These, too, can cloud awareness and pull us away from clear presence. In relationships, this precept asks a simple but powerful question: am I really here? Am I engaging from clarity, or from a fog of habit, fear, or the addiction to being liked? Each time you ask, it invites you back to awareness, so your connections are not filtered through distortion but touched by honesty and care. When practiced gently, the precepts begin to repair what trauma once interrupted. They create a field of safety in relationship, not because everything is perfect, but because it is anchored. You stop relating from your most defended self, and start relating from the part of you that can remain present. Even when it hurts, you become less afraid of conflict, because you trust your intention to remain kind. You become less dependent on agreement, because you're no longer speaking to win, but to understand. And one of the most powerful shifts here is this: the ability to remain in disagreement without rupture. When your intention is clear, when your words are honest, and when your actions stay respectful, connection can survive tension. That is the heart of relational wholeness, not a fragile harmony that breaks at the first sign of conflict, but a resilient presence that can hold both closeness and difference. The precepts also guide you when you are the one who has caused harm. Instead of collapsing into guilt or becoming defensive, you pause to reflect: where did I step out of integrity? What fear was driving me? What needs were left unmet? And from that honest reflection, you move to make amends, not to erase what happened, but to restore trust. This kind of accountability is not about punishment. It is about repair. It shows both you and the other person that harm can be acknowledged and yet the connection can still hold. When you practice the precepts as relational tools, You begin to notice your own boundaries becoming clearer. You recognize when someone else is not showing up with the same commitment to clarity or care. And instead of trying to change them, or losing yourself in the process, you choose to step back, not with judgment, but with respect for your own well-being. The precepts do not make you passive. They make you discerning, and slowly, they begin to reshape your inner world too. The way you speak to yourself softens. You stop using harsh words against your own heart. You stop grabbing for attention inside your mind through guilt or blame. Instead, you begin to treat your inner life with more care. Over time, this kindness becomes natural. You no longer need to force discipline onto yourself. Gentleness simply arises on its own when you are aligned. This work may look subtle on the surface. It doesn't always make a dramatic show, but inside, the shift is profound. The energy you once spent defending, managing, or controlling relationships is freed. Now, that energy flows into deeper connection. You are no longer using others to fill a hole inside you. Instead, you begin to show up whole, so that you can relate more fully. And with that wholeness, you start to feel safer being seen, not just in your strengths, but in your rawness too. Because you know you are showing up with integrity. You are no longer hiding behind politeness or pleasing. You are no longer abandoning yourself just to keep the peace. You speak and listen with intention. You create space for others to do the same. And when they cannot, you grieve it honestly, without pretense. You stop twisting yourself just to be accepted in places where there is no room for truth. The precepts gently guide you back into connection, without erasing who you are. You begin to realize that sometimes leaving a dishonest relationship can be just as loving, just as compassionate, as staying in one that is honest. Over time, the precepts stop feeling like rules or practices you have to remember. They begin to feel like qualities of being, woven into the way you live. You embody non-harming not because you're trying hard, but because it feels natural. It feels right. You speak the truth without needing to rehearse it. You set boundaries without shame or guilt. You give and receive without confusion. And your relationships begin to reflect this inner work. Not because they become perfect, but because you are showing up with presence. Healing, after all, is not about becoming invulnerable. It is about becoming more intimate, both with others and with yourself. The precepts do not protect you from pain. They do something subtler, something deeper. They support you through pain. They remind you of what truly matters when your emotions try to pull you away. They help you return to alignment when you've drifted. And slowly, your connections become places of growth, rather than places of reenacting old wounds. They become spaces where you feel both free and rooted, where you can love without losing yourself, and stay without pretending. This is the kind of freedom that relational practice offers. A life where wholeness is not something you have to protect desperately, but something you can share, urgently, honestly, fully. When relationships begin to feel less like battlefields and more like shared spaces for growth, something deeper begins to settle in your body. You stop walking on eggshells. You stop bracing for impact. You stop rehearsing every single word before you speak. Instead, you begin to feel trust, not only in your mind, but in your nervous system. Safety is no longer just an idea. It becomes a felt sense. And that shift, from concept to embodiment, marks a profound turning point in practice. All the insight in the world doesn't mean much if it doesn't reach your body, your breath, your posture. This is where the path of awakening moves from theory into lived experience. It is where the somatic Buddha within you comes alive, not by reciting teachings, but by becoming them. The body is not separate from practice. The body is the ground of practice. Long before your mind learned to form concepts, to weave stories, Your body felt everything. It recorded joy, tension, grief, relief. Every breath you held back. Every time your jaw clenched. Every moment you flinched or froze, your body remembers. And when you begin to meet the body as a site of awakening, something changes. You stop bypassing these imprints. You begin to heal in real time, in real space, through real sensation. Somatic presence begins with awareness, not an abstract, distant observation, but direct attention to what is happening right now. Moment by moment, the temperature on your skin, the texture of your breath, the subtle pressure in your chest, the small movements of your muscles. You start to notice where you habitually contract, where you go numb, where you quietly check out. And those moments of noticing become openings, not problems to fix, but doorways into deeper listening. The more you attend to your body with kindness, the more it begins to speak back to you, not in words, but in subtle cues, whispers of sensation, invitations to soften, a chest that feels tight, and then softens with a single exhale. A tingling in the hands when something important is finally spoken. A gentle ease that washes over you the moment you tell the truth. These are not random sensations. They are signs of integration, subtle reminders that your practice is landing. That the Dharma is no longer just an idea circling in your head, but a wisdom that lives within your very cells. You don't need to explain these sensations away. What matters is learning to trust them. And that trust grows stronger each time you choose to feel your way through life. Instead of trying to think your way through everything, bringing awareness into the body also transforms how you meet emotional pain. Instead of collapsing under the weight of sadness, or running away from fear, you begin to notice where those emotions live in the body. Perhaps it's a tightness in the throat, a heaviness that sits in the belly, a buzzing that lingers along the spine. And in those moments, you breathe into those places gently, as though you were softening around them. You give them space, you make room, and by doing so, you allow the emotion to move. What once felt like stuckness begins to flow. The energy of the emotion is no longer denied, it is metabolized, transformed, released. This process creates something powerful, a sense of safety inside yourself. Your body begins to trust that you will not abandon it in moments of distress. You're not forcing it to be calm. You're simply listening to what it needs. Sometimes that means stillness and rest. Sometimes it means movement, or even sound. The more attuned you become, the more your body shifts from being just a vessel for thoughts into a true partner in healing. This embodiment also deepens your understanding of impermanence. While your mind may insist that pain will last forever, your body shows you a different truth. You feel how tension rises and falls. You feel sensations shift with every breath. You witness how what once felt unbearable slowly dissolves, sometimes into warmth, sometimes into spaciousness. These are not trophies of success. They are simple reminders that everything moves. Everything changes. Life itself is lived in cycles. And that realization brings comfort, not from control, but from intimacy with what is real. Integrating the Dharma through the body even changes your posture. Not just the way you hold yourself physically, but the energy you radiate. You begin to stand with more ease. You stop collapsing into shame or puffing up in defense. Your spine supports you without strain. Your chest opens without exposing. And your presence becomes felt, even in silence. People notice, even if they cannot name why. This embodied presence also transforms how you speak and listen. When you're grounded in your body, your words slow down. You pause more often. You hear not only the words being spoken, but the feelings beneath them. And your responses carry weight, not because they're polished or rehearsed, but because they come from stillness. This kind of communication has its own healing power. It's not about being eloquent. It's about being real. Even your breath becomes a teacher. You begin to notice how it shortens when you're anxious, and how it deepens when you're connected. You stop trying to control it. Instead, you follow it, like a quiet guide. It brings you back to center. Again and again. Over time, when your mind scatters, the body learns automatically. Your first instinct is not to run to thought, but to return to the breath. Bringing the Dharma into the body also begins to dismantle the trap of spiritual perfectionism. You stop chasing after peak experiences. You stop waiting for fireworks to prove you are awake. Instead, you start trusting what is real. You begin to see that the most profound awakenings often come wrapped in the most ordinary sensations. The feeling of your feet touching the ground, the steady rhythm of your breathing, the quiet presence of being here. Now, the warmth in your palms, the release in your neck after letting go of tension you didn't even realize you were holding. These are not small distractions. They are Dharma made visible through the body. Movement practices can help open this doorway. A slow walking meditation, a gentle stretch when you wake, somatic inquiry, or even the simple, everyday rituals like washing your hands or drinking a cup of tea. When these ordinary actions are done with awareness, they become sacred, not because of what they accomplish, but because of how fully you meet them in that moment. This path also awakens a deep compassion for the body itself. You stop seeing your body as something to fix, to fight, or to transcend. Instead, you begin to love it, not in a superficial or aesthetic way, but in a quiet, devotional way. You thank your body for carrying you through the hardest days. You listen when it asks for gentleness. You forgive it for holding pain it never chose. And as this relationship deepens, your very sense of self begins to shift. You no longer define yourself only by what you think. You begin to trust what you feel, not as absolute truth, but as information, as guidance. Your identity becomes less rigid, more open, more spacious. It becomes rooted in lived experience rather than rigid labels. This makes you resilient in a new way. When conflict arises, you ground yourself by feeling your feet on the floor. When grief arrives, you soften your belly. When anger flares, you remember to breathe into your chest. You don't bypass the emotion, you contain it with presence. And this containment is not suppression. It is protection. It gives space for clarity to emerge, without adding more harm. Over time, your body becomes the most honest part of your practice. It tells you when you're aligned. It tells you when you're pushing too hard. It tells you when it's time to rest. And you learn to listen. In that listening, you return again and again to a deeper truth. Awakening is not an idea. It is something lived. This kind of integration can't be transmitted through words alone. It must be practiced, felt, remembered, through your own flesh, your own breath, your own presence. Every time you bring awareness to a sensation, you are building the path beneath your feet. Every time you stay with discomfort without abandoning yourself, you are gently rewiring your nervous system to trust presence over panic. And it is this trust that allows deeper insight to take root. The kind of insight that doesn't just shift how you think, but changes how you live. At some point, you no longer need to explain the Dharma, you simply become it. You embody it in how you move, in how you breathe, in how you hold the people around you. Not just physically, but energetically. This is the somatic Buddha. Not a distant figure you bow to, but a presence you allow to flow through you. Of course, you may still struggle, you may still forget, but your return becomes quicker. Your body becomes your anchor. And your practice feels whole, not because you have mastered it, but because you have allowed it to touch every part of you, mind, heart, and body, fully, quietly, without leaving anything behind. When presence is something you feel through your skin, when every breath brings you back to the ground beneath your feet. Your idea of healing begins to transform. Healing no longer means fixing or solving. It becomes about returning to the body, to the breath, to this moment. And yet, even in this intimacy, the world still demands words. It fills the space with noise, with reaction, with endless reaching, but beneath all of it, there remains something older than language, something more whole than thought, something you can only feel when you are fully here. A space where nothing needs to be explained. A space that asks for no performance, no proving. That space is silence. But silence is often misunderstood. Many people mistake it for withdrawal, for emptiness, even for distance. Yet true silence, what Buddhist practice calls noble silence, is not absence at all. It is presence, but presence without interference. It is not quiet because nothing is happening. It is quiet because nothing extra needs to be added. And in this way, silence is not passive. It is alive. It listens. It holds. It heals. For those who have lived in survival mode, the absence of noise can feel unsettling at first. Silence may stir up old fears, fears of being ignored, unseen, or left without anything to prove your worth in the world. This is why noble silence is not an escape. It is a practice, not a retreat from life, but a deeper re-entry into what is real. When you learn to stay, to soften, and to simply listen in the absence of words, something begins to surface. You start to notice the deeper layers of your being, the parts that don't scream for attention, the voices within that only speak when the noise finally subsides. Healing through silence requires trust, not in silence itself, but in your own capacity to meet what arises within it. Because when the distractions fall away, what's left are often the parts of you still waiting to be seen: old grief, lingering tension, tenderness that never had room to breathe. These aspects of self don't need to be fixed or analyzed. They need to be allowed, and silence gives them that permission. Of course, the mind will try to fill the silence with planning, with remembering, with endless analyzing. That's natural. The habit of constant thinking is strong. But the practice here is not to shut thought down. The invitation is simply to step back from the need to follow it. When you sit in silence and let the mind move without clinging, something subtle shifts. You begin to notice the gaps between thoughts. You begin to feel what lives underneath the story. And those gaps, far from empty, are full of clarity, full of sensation, full of presence. In that presence, healing happens, not because you've discovered some new explanation, but because you've stopped reinforcing what is no longer true. You've stopped repeating the story of urgency, of lack, of self-judgment. You've allowed something else to step forward, something quieter, something whole. And this doesn't require long retreats or hours of formal meditation. It begins in small, simple ways: pausing before replying, walking without headphones, allowing silence to live in a conversation, instead of rushing to fill it, staying with a difficult emotion, without naming it right away. These are radical ACTs of simplicity. ACTs that restore balance to the nervous system. ACTs that remind the body it does not need to stay on guard every moment of the day. Silence also reconnects you with your own inner rhythms. When the external world is loud, it's so easy to lose touch with your body's signals. Hunger, fatigue, emotions, they all get drowned out by noise. But when you step into silence with intention, these signals become audible again. You start to notice the pace your body actually wants to move at. You begin to hear what your heart has been trying to whisper all along. And this kind of listening changes the way you relate. You speak less to impress, and more to truly connect. You stop rehearsing your response while someone else is still speaking. You let their words land. You let silence punctuate the exchange. In this way, silence becomes part of the dialogue itself. It creates space for truth to surface, not only from the mind, but also from the body, from intuition, from something deeper. Noble silence is also a protection. It shields your energy from scattering, from being spent on noise that never nourishes. Silence has a way of holding your attention in one place, just long enough for depth to emerge. In silence, you are no longer performing. You're not seeking approval. You're not trying to prove anything. And when all that effort drops away, something remarkable happens. You suddenly free up immense inner resources that were once spent managing your image. The nervous system begins to shift, slowly but surely, from defense into ease. You start to recognize the difference between pretending to be calm and actually being calm. Silence, you see, is not about withdrawing from connection. It's about preparing yourself for a deeper, more genuine connection. When you return from silence, you come back more attuned, more available, more anchored in your own being. Your words begin to carry a different weight, because they're no longer covering discomfort. They're simply expressions of clarity. And yet, silence also has a way of revealing things we often avoid. It can show you how you try to control life, the way you might interrupt discomfort with noise, or resist stillness because of what it might uncover. But seeing these patterns is not a failure. In fact, it's the very beginning of integration. Silence doesn't require you to be fearless. It only asks that you stay long enough to meet yourself without fleeing. Over time, your nervous system begins to recognize silence not as danger, but as safety, and eventually, you start to crave it, not as an escape from the world, but as nourishment, a return to center, a space where nothing has to be managed, where the breath, the body, and the moment are enough. Silence also restores your sense of proportion. You know how, when you're overwhelmed, the mind tends to magnify problems, spinning out scenarios, tightening around the worst-case outcome. In silence, you start to see how much of that suffering is simply mental construction. You begin to discern what is real, and what is projection. This clarity doesn't deny pain. It simply stops feeding the parts of it that are optional. You learn how to sit with discomfort without demanding an immediate fix. You stop interrupting your own growth just for the sake of temporary relief. In this way, silence becomes a teacher of patience. Not patience as a forced virtue, but patience as a natural fruit of presence. You begin to trust that answers will come in their own time, that certain things unfold gracefully when not pushed. Noble silence, then, becomes a regenerative force. It restores what constant stimulation drains. It grounds what endless striving unsettles. It reconnects the parts of you that busyness has pulled apart. And the beauty is, you don't need to change anything for this to happen. You simply need to stop adding for long enough to let balance return on its own. Silence also reveals what is already working in your life. You begin to notice the simple patterns that bring ease, the relationships that feel mutual, the rhythms that naturally support your well-being. And these insights, they don't come from analysis. They come from direct felt sense, from listening deeply to what your body has been whispering all along. And that trust, once felt, begins to flow outward into action. Silence doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. You speak only when there's something real to say. You act only when the time is right. You are no longer driven by reactivity, you are moved by alignment. And that shift in motivation, it changes everything. It's not only in how you relate to others, but also in how you carry yourself through life. Silence is where wisdom quietly matures. You may listen to the same teaching 100 times, but often it does not truly sink in until you meet it in stillness. Insight ripens, not when you chase after it, But when you allow it to settle naturally, sometimes, you don't need more words, more explanations, or more information. What you really need is space. Space for what you already know. Deep inside, to finally integrate. Noble silence can be practiced formally, like in meditation retreats, yet it can also live within you, quietly, in the middle of ordinary life. You can choose not to speak unnecessarily. You can choose to stop explaining yourself when no explanation is needed. You can let go of that habit of narrating your every experience out loud. This isn't repression, it's refinement, a gentle discipline that shapes you into someone more grounded. Slowly, silence teaches a profound lesson, that presence is stronger than explanation. That true connection does not depend on constant talking. That your worth is not measured by the words you produce, but by the quality of your being. The more you trust this, the stronger and more resilient you become. Silence trains you to stay with yourself fully, not just with the polished or likable parts, but with the raw, uncertain, sometimes uncomfortable sides as well. And in that same way, it teaches you how to be with others, not leaning on them to soothe your unease, not expecting them to distract you, but simply standing present together. Silence is not the absence of meaning. It is the space where meaning arises, not because you chased after it, but because you made room for it to come. And so you return to silence, not just once in a while, but daily. You meet it in small pauses, in a breath before a decision, in the quiet moment before you respond, in the subtle gap between thought and reaction. Over time, silence stops feeling like a void. It becomes a companion, not an escape, but a guide, not a place you run to when lost, but the home you return to because you are finally ready to listen.
In my own life, silence is rare. There is always a message, a notification, or some background noise. But the moment I turn everything off and just breathe, I acknowledge my mind the most clearly. Have you ever felt that too?
And when silence is no longer something you avoid, when you trust it as nourishment rather than absence, your whole relationship with desire begins to shift. The inner noise that used to cover over deeper truths starts to quiet down. And in that stillness, something raw and undeniable begins to rise. Craving, not always the obvious craving for things, or for attention, but a subtle pull that whispers beneath almost every restless thought. A longing that doesn't even have a clear object. A voice that says, "This moment is not quite enough." Even in silence, the mind reaches. It waits for what's next. It looks for what might be better. But here's the question: what happens when you stop pushing craving away, and instead turn toward it with compassion? What happens when enough is no longer a finish line you're chasing, but a place you learn to stand in? In Buddhist teachings, craving, tanha, is described as one of the roots of suffering. But to understand craving is not the same as rejecting it. The impulse to crave is simply human. It arises from contact, from perception, from memory. The problem isn't that we want. The problem begins when we cling, when the mind believes it cannot rest until it grasps what it desires, or until every trace of discomfort is erased.
For a long time, I was always running for success, for recognition, for more. But the more I chased, the more tired I became. One day, I stopped and whispered to myself, "I have enough for now." And strangely, that was the first time I felt light.
To relate to craving skillfully, we first have to stop judging it. Craving is not evidence of failure. It doesn't mean you're not advanced enough in your practice. It is simply the natural response of a system that once learned to associate certain conditions with safety, with love, with belonging, and such a system doesn't need shame. It needs to be seen, to be understood, and to be met with gentleness, not with force. That system inside you, the one that has learned to grasp for safety, does not need shame. It doesn't need you to scold it or crush it. What it truly needs is to be seen, to be understood, and to be met without force. Releasing craving does not mean turning your back on life. It doesn't mean suppressing your desires or cutting yourself off from joy. Instead, it means letting go of the old belief that your well-being depends on the next thing. That thing could be a person, a new feeling, a resolution to a problem, or even a shinier version of yourself. The art of enough is not about giving up. It is about seeing clearly. Enough is what naturally arises when the heart loosens its grip, not because someone told it to, but because it no longer believes it must hold on so tightly. And how do you reach this? You begin by simply noticing the ways craving shows up in your daily life. It's not only in big moments of ambition or desire. It's there in the small whispers when the mind says, "Not yet." It shows up in the endless scroll through your phone, in the urge to add just one more task before resting, in that restless inner voice that keeps saying, "This isn't it, something's missing." Craving often disguises itself behind productivity, behind restlessness, even behind self-improvement. You don't need to fight these urges as if they're enemies. Instead, you need to pause, notice them, name them gently, and ask, what is this wanting really pointing toward? So often, craving is not about the thing itself, it is protecting something softer, more vulnerable, perhaps a fear of being left behind, perhaps a longing to feel whole, perhaps just a quiet wish to be seen and loved. When you meet craving with presence, you begin to hear that tender voice beneath it. That voice doesn't need to be silenced. It needs to be held with care. You don't overcome craving by repressing it, you outgrow its urgency by meeting it at the root. And this meeting does not happen in the mind alone. It happens in the body. Craving has a texture. You can feel it in the tightening of your jaw, the restless twitch in your hands, the heaviness or heat in your chest. When you notice the pull to grasp or reach, pause, locate it in the body. Stay with it, even if it's uncomfortable. Breathe into that place gently. Soften your response. This doesn't magically erase desire, but it creates something more precious, space. And space is what breaks the cycle of compulsion. The body often knows when enough has arrived, but the mind doesn't always listen. The mind has been trained to keep running, for more clarity, more validation, more comfort. So learning the art of enough begins with building trust in the body's signals. A deep exhale, shoulders that finally release, the jaw that loosens without effort. These are not small things. They are real signs of sufficiency, and they are worth honoring. Craving can also be deceptive. Sometimes it dresses up as hope, or even as motivation. The difference lies in the energy. When action is rooted in clarity, it feels spacious, like there is air around it. When action is rooted in craving, it feels tight, desperate, urgent. One carries you forward with balance, while the other keeps pulling you in circles. This is something you don't figure out by overthinking. You learn it by sensing, by feeling directly in your own body. Craving shrinks the moment. It whispers, "Not this, not enough." But the path of enough invites you to stay. Let's remain here just a little longer. And slowly, your relationship to pleasure shifts too. The practice is not to avoid pleasure, but to stop clinging to it. You allow yourself to enjoy what arises without needing it to last forever. You taste joy without fearing its end. You find peace right in the middle of change, because you no longer believe that satisfaction must be permanent to be real. Pleasure then becomes what it truly is, momentary, beautiful, free. This also transforms the way you pursue your goals. You still create, You still move forward, you still dream, but your effort is no longer fueled by pressure or a sense of lack. Instead, it is rooted in presence. You act not because you're trying to fill a hole, but because what you're doing feels aligned. Your work, your choices, your path stop being about proving yourself. They become offerings, natural expressions of who you already are. You don't need the result to validate your worth, because, in the quiet of your own being, you've already touched what is enough. When you begin to trust the path of enough, your actions naturally become cleaner, less about proving yourself, more about offering from the heart. You no longer need outcomes to validate your worth, because you've already touched the truth of sufficiency within. Even in relationships, craving often sneaks in quietly. You may find yourself longing for reassurance, seeking constant attention, or reaching for closeness. None of these are wrong. But when they are fueled by fear, they begin to distort the connection. Instead of resting in trust, you start monitoring. Instead of clarity, your asking comes tangled with uncertainty. The path of enough invites a new way. You learn to give space, not out of detachment, but out of respect, for your own inner steadiness, and for the natural rhythm of the other person. And when that familiar ache of not enough rises inside, you don't need to rush to patch it. Instead, you pause, you let it speak, you let it show you the tender places that still long to be seen. Sometimes, what's needed is not a quick solution, but a witness. You can become that witness, for yourself, and even for another, to simply stay, with gentleness. Over time, this practice plants a different kind of stability in your life. You no longer depend on constant external highs to feel safe. You can walk through loss without falling apart. You can meet uncertainty without gripping for control. You can even feel the hunger of desire without feeding it with confusion. This isn't about control, it's about maturity. About learning the capacity to be with life as it is, not endlessly chasing it as you think it should be. The teachings are clear. Desire itself is not the enemy. Desire becomes suffering only when it hardens into clinging, into tanha. The work, then, is not to stop wanting, but to let go of the belief that you are somehow incomplete until every desire is fulfilled. Because you are not incomplete. You are unfolding. Craving says, you are missing something. Wisdom whispers, you are remembering something. And what you are remembering is this: the heart can still be full even when the hands are empty. The breath can still feel whole even in the middle of grief. The moment can still be complete even without a perfect resolution. This is not just a mindset. It is a lived truth, discovered slowly, patiently, through attention. To support yourself on this path, you don't need elaborate rituals. You can begin with something simple. Each morning, whisper to yourself, I have enough for now. Say it not as a restriction, but as a ground beneath your feet. Return to it whenever you feel the pull of grasping. Breathe it in, let it sink into your bones. It doesn't mean you will never grow, never dream, never reach further. It simply means you no longer place your fulfillment only in what comes next.
Every morning, I whisper to myself, I have enough for now. This doesn't stop me from dreaming. It simply stops me from endless comparison. Try saying it softly to yourself. You may be surprised how peace arises on its own.
Yes, you may forget, because craving is persistent. But each time you remember, you return more gently, and every return strengthens the truth. You are allowed to rest in what is already here. You are allowed to pause before reaching. You are allowed to feel full even without more. This kind of freedom is not loud, not dramatic, but it is lasting. It builds a life rooted in presence rather than pursuit. In ease, not exhaustion. In reverence, not rush. You stop trying to fill every space and begin to honor the silence between. And that silence, far from being empty, reveals itself as sacred. The art of enough is not a rejection of desire. It is the recognition that your true home is not waiting at the end of craving. It is here, within the breath that meets you, within the body that holds you, within the awareness that stays steady through it all, whispering softly, "You are not waiting to begin. You are already here." When the grip of craving finally loosens, and the mind begins to settle into a sense of sufficiency, something surprising often stirs beneath the surface. Without that constant chase for more, space begins to open up, space that isn't empty, but alive with possibility, and in that spaciousness, things you've been carrying for years, perhaps without even realizing, begin to rise. The roles you've played, the masks you've worn, the personas you've built, the inner scaffolding you relied on to feel worthy or safe, all of it begins to reveal itself. At one time, these identities served you well. They helped you belong, they gave you structure, and made life feel predictable. But now, in the quiet, some of them feel too tight. What once protected you may no longer fit the person you are becoming. And this is not failure, it's transition. It's a gentle ending that doesn't demand destruction, but asks instead for grace. This is where what some call ego death shows itself. Not as something terrifying, but as something tender. Letting identities dissolve is not about erasing who you are. It's about making room for what is most real to emerge. In Buddhism, ego doesn't just mean pride or arrogance. It points to that sense of a fixed self, a self that clings to continuity, control, and certainty. But the truth of life is change. The truth of being is impermanence. And it is our resistance to this truth that creates suffering. Not because the self is bad, but because clinging to it restricts what you can feel, how you can grow, and where life can take you. Most ego deaths are not sudden explosions. They are subtle. A role you once carried starts to feel exhausting. A belief about yourself no longer makes sense. A familiar reaction no longer brings relief. These are signs, signals, that something is ready to fall away. And rather than rejecting or judging that part, you can thank it, and then gently release it. It's not about attacking the ego, but about making space for who you are without all the armor. To do this, presence is everything. You begin to watch yourself more softly. You notice the way your body tenses when someone disagrees with you. You feel the heat rise when you're not praised. You catch that panic when an old title or label no longer applies. These are not flaws. They are messages from the parts of you that have been holding on too long. Those parts don't need punishment, they need compassion. And when an identity dissolves, grief often follows. Even if that identity was painful, it still gave you something to hold on to. Letting it go can leave you feeling groundless. That sense of, I don't know who I am anymore, it's not a crisis. It's a doorway. The key is not to rush to fill the space with another label or story. The practice is to stay with the openness. To allow yourself to be unfamiliar, undefined, undone. That takes courage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet strength that lets you stay open even as certainty fades. Buddhism reminds us, this process is not about erasing the self, but seeing through its illusion. The self is not solid. It is a set of conditions, shaped by memory, by culture, by emotion, by thought. None of it fixed, all of it in constant change. And from this perspective, letting go of identity feels less like loss and more like freedom. You realize you no longer need to keep proving who you are. You no longer need to reinforce an image that no longer serves you.
I used to wear the mask of being the strong one, always fine, always in control. But the more I held that mask, the further I drifted from myself. When I admit this, I'm also vulnerable and I need support. Only then this I feel some real relief. Are you holding on to a mass like that?
Instead, you begin to move with more fluidity, less defense, and much more presence. These shifts don't always arrive with fireworks. Often, they show up in the smallest details of daily life. You begin to speak less to impress others. You stop putting on the performance of confidence when inside you feel uncertain. Instead of pretending to know, you allow yourself to ask questions. You let your opinions change with time. You even notice those subtle moments when you cling to being the helpful one, the strong one, or the wise one. And in those very moments, you pause, you breathe, and you gently loosen your grip. Sometimes, the identity that starts to fall away is one born out of old pain, like the survivor, the overachiever, or the one who never asks for help. These roles were not mistakes. They carried you through difficult times. They kept you safe when you needed protection. But you are not bound to them forever. You are allowed to grow beyond them. You are allowed to become someone who doesn't carry every burden alone. Letting these identities dissolve does not mean erasing your history or forgetting what shaped you. It means releasing the belief that you are only that shape, that your worth depends on always holding everything together. And when the self becomes less rigid, compassion begins to blossom. You stop seeing others through fixed labels too. You allow them to change. You forgive them for evolving. And you react less to their defenses, because you can recognize your own. Of course, this process is not always gentle. Even when you approach it with care, sometimes it feels confusing. Sometimes it feels like loss. But here's the truth: every time you let something fall away, something more honest rises up. Not something better, but something more real, more alive to the present, less chained to the past. So while it may seem like you're becoming less, in reality you're becoming more whole. Not more consistent, not more polished, but more authentic. The Dharma does not promise you a flawless or perfected version of yourself. Instead, it offers freedom, the release from the heavy burden of perfection. It reminds you that who you are is not a trophy to defend, but a process to live. And for this, emotional safety is essential. Ego death must be cradled in compassion. Your nervous system needs to feel safe enough to loosen its grip on control. Your body needs to trust that softening won't lead to danger. That's why presence, breath, and embodiment are at the center of this work. You don't rise above the body to let go of ego. You anchor into the body so that letting go feels safe. Rituals can help ease this transition. Write a letter to the identity you're ready to release. Thank it for what it offered you. Acknowledge the ways it protected you. Honor what it cost you. And then, when you're ready, let it go. This isn't performance, it's closure. A shift from unconscious clinging to conscious release. Community supports this too. Safe spaces where you can say, "I don't know who I am right now," and still be loved. Places where transformation is not pathologized but respected. We were never meant to deconstruct ourselves alone. We need mirrors, people who will not demand we stay the same. As you continue this practice, you may find yourself feeling lighter, more open, less desperate to arrive. You start to trust that you don't need to know exactly who you are in every single moment. You can simply show up, meet what is here, and respond with care. This isn't the erasure of self, it's intimacy with change. The art of gentle ego death is learning to release without collapsing, to loosen without losing integrity, to shed without shame. It is walking through these small deaths with presence so that something new, something truer, something more aligned, can be born. And over time, you discover that what remains after these gentle deaths is not emptiness. It is clarity, not an empty shell, but a living center, one that does not cling to identity, but moves freely with life. one that doesn't grasp to be someone, but trusts the unfolding. This is not an end. It is a return not to a fixed version of yourself, but to the fluid essence that has always lived underneath it all, the part of you that can hold change without fear. The part that knows that every ending carries within it the seed of a beginning. And in that knowing, peace quietly arises, not because you've perfected yourself, but because you've finally stopped trying so hard. You've allowed yourself to become who you are, again and again, with softness, with breath, and with grace. You've walked through teachings not meant to impress the world, but to restore you, gently, deeply, honestly. You've touched the power of soft awareness, the warmth of repairing your forgotten self, the sacred stillness of pause, the release of craving, and the quiet joy of letting go. And maybe now, you remember, healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it rests in silence, sometimes it looks like saying, I don't need to be more in order to belong to myself. This journey isn't about becoming someone else. It's about coming home, breath by breath, lesson by lesson, to the person you've always been underneath it all. Not by force, not through perfection, but by returning, again and again, with kindness. And now, it's your turn to offer something back. If these words resonate with you, I invite you to leave a comment below. I am learning to rest in wholeness. Let it be more than a sentence. Let it be your quiet commitment to pause, to breathe, to return. And if this journey spoke to you, softly and honestly, subscribe to the channel. There is more waiting for you here. Not more noise, but more of what truly matters. You don't have to walk this path alone. We walk it gently, together.
If you are listening to this before sleep, take one slow, gentle breath and feel the fullness in this very moment. You don't need to wait until tomorrow to be home, because right here, right now, you already are.